Hey guys, tonight the first topic we explore reveals a haunting truth about the past. The way women's emotions, fears and mental health were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed and even punished. From ancient medicine to Victorian asylums, from so-called hysteria to dangerous remedies, we're about to walk through centuries of treatments, both bizarre and heartbreaking, that were once considered normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin our journey in ancient Greece, land of philosophers, myths, and oddly specific medical theories. Picture this. You're a woman in 400 BCE, and for weeks now, you've been feeling off. Your chest feels tight, your heart races for no reason, and sometimes you get this overwhelming wave of panic. You try to explain it to the local healer, and after some dramatic chin-stroking, he proudly diagnoses you with a wandering womb. Yes, you heard that right. The esteemed Hippocrates, the guy who gave us the Hippocratic Oath, genuinely believed that women's wombs had minds of their own. According to him, if a woman became too emotional, too anxious, or even too celibate, her uterus might just pack its bags and start roaming around the body like a lost tourist. Up toward the chest, down to the legs, wherever it fancied really. And the symptoms that followed, dizziness, breathlessness, trembling, were the result of this nomadic organ wreaking havoc. Now, the treatment? Not exactly what you'd hope for. No cozy blanket or herbal tea. Instead, doctors would waft pleasant-smelling herbs near the pelvis and foul-smelling ones near the nose, trying to lure the womb back to its rightful place. Imagine lying there while someone waves burning garlic under your face like they're trying to perform a séance for your uterus. All very scientific, of course, and in a society where women couldn't vote, own land, or even wear pants. This bizarre diagnosis was the only explanation people had for female distress. Anxiety wasn't seen as a mental or emotional experience. It was reduced to rogue reproductive behavior. To be fair, the Greeks were working with what they had. No brain scans, no serotonin theory, no trauma-informed care. But still, blaming everything on a misbehaving uterus. That's like your car breaking down and the mechanic saying, "Ah, yes, the cup holder is wandering again." The truth is, ancient women were feeling deeply grief, fear, stress, uncertainty. But instead of being asked how they felt, they were handed incense and told their womb was misaligned. And so, the silence began. Not just of misunderstood symptoms, but of unheard stories. Now we drift into ancient Rome, where civilization was advancing, plumbing was impressive, and compassion was, well, still under construction. If you were a Roman woman struggling with anxiety, there was no therapist to call, no hotline to reach out to, and certainly no relaxing bath bomb to toss in the aqueduct. Instead, you'd be told to get married, or have a child, or both. Quickly. Because, according to the medical minds of the time, who were, surprise, almost exclusively male, your emotional distress was caused by your uterus being underemployed. They didn't call it anxiety, they called it furor uterinus, which sounds like a Roman battle formation but was actually their term for female emotional instability. And if you cried too much, spoke out of turn, or seemed generally agitated, well, maybe you were just failing at your womanly duties. The cure? Childbirth. Repeatedly. One Roman physician, Serranus, who actually wrote a gynecological textbook, recommended that women avoid strong emotions altogether. Just stop feeling things. Problem solved. He also advised husbands to be gentle, which in Roman terms likely meant not yelling during dinner. If you were a wealthy Roman woman and showed signs of anxiety, you might be prescribed wine and music. Not terrible, until you remember that the diagnosis was still rooted in a belief that your womb was malfunctioning, like a broken machine in a bakery. For poorer women, the remedies were more direct. Herbal mixtures, spiritual rites, or being ignored entirely. And heaven forbid you questioned your husband's authority, or didn't smile at dinner, or cried too long after a miscarriage. That might get you labelled unstable, or worse, accused of being possessed by spirits or influenced by the gods. Nothing says compassionate care like a priest waving chicken bones around while you sob on a marble bench. So while Rome gave us roads, laws, and architecture, it gave anxious women nothing but shame wrapped in olive leaves. Their pain was medicalized, moralized, and then minimized, because in the end, no one asked what they were going through. They just asked when their next child was due. Now, let's walk softly into the shadowy corridors of the Middle Ages, a time when knights roamed, plagues bloomed, and if a woman had anxiety, it probably meant Satan was renting space in her soul. Medical understanding didn't just stall during this period, it practically reversed into oncoming traffic. The Greek ideas of womb wandering were still hanging around, but now they were seasoned with a generous dose of fear, fire, and holy panic. Women who experienced what we now call anxiety, trembling, crying, panic attacks, intrusive thoughts, were often seen as spiritually compromised. Because clearly, if your hands shook or you wept at night, it wasn't trauma, it was demons. The church dominated the landscape of healing, and that healing often came in the form of exorcisms, public humiliation, or, if things escalated, a bonfire with your name on it. If a woman admitted to hearing voices, or simply seemed off, she could be accused of witchcraft. Herbal remedies, suspicious, knowledge of the stars, satanic, crying too much, clearly a gateway to evil. In this era, anxiety wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared. And fear in the wrong woman's body could get her locked in a convent, dunked in a river, or tried in a courtroom where the evidence included she looked weird during Mass. There were also monasteries and infirmaries where nuns attempted to care for women with mental distress. But without any true understanding of the mind, treatment usually meant long prayers, isolation, and fasting. Because nothing soothes the soul like low blood sugar and total silence. And let's not forget the diagnostic tools of the day. If your anxiety caused you to faint or tremble, someone might press a cross to your forehead and see if you flinched. If you did, well, say goodbye to your goats and prepare to meet the village torchbearer. It's tragic, really. These women weren't witches or sinners or hostels for demonic spirits. They were people in pain. People trying to breathe through sorrow, trying to sleep through dread. But in a world built on fear, a woman who trembled became a threat, and threats were burned, not understood. Ah, the Renaissance. A golden age of rebirth. Art, science, literature. Everything was being rediscovered. Except, unfortunately, compassion for women's mental health. That apparently stayed locked in a medieval cellar. While Michelangelo was chiseling David and Da Vinci was sketching helicopters, doctors were still trying to figure out why women had feelings. And surprise, the leading theory was still the same tired villain, the uterus. Though ancient texts resurfaced, they were often filtered through newer, more refined interpretations, which is a fancy way of saying they still blamed women's emotions on being too female. Anxious? That's because you're not married. Panicking? You need to conceive. Depressed? Time for a good leeching. Yes, leeches. Or, if you were lucky, cupping, bleeding, or a hot poultice to your abdomen. Doctors truly believed the body needed to be balanced. And for women, that meant draining them until their soul quieted down, or at least until they fainted and stopped talking. And the remedies didn't end there. There were also soothing rituals, like being confined to a dark room for days, or advised not to read, because a woman with too many books might start thinking. And thinking, of course, was hazardous to your womb's stability. In elite households, women suffering from nervous complaints might be sent to the countryside for rest, which sounded nice on paper, but often meant being watched, silenced, and dosed with herbal tonics until they smiled again, or at least pretended to. The Renaissance loved beauty. It celebrated harmony and proportion. But it did not know what to do with a woman who wept uncontrollably or couldn't sleep through the night. Emotional pain, especially in women, was seen as unruly, unbalanced, inconvenient, so it was muted, draped in silk, locked behind chamber doors, dismissed as womanly trouble. And in the grand halls where paintings were born and symphonies were composed, women with anxiety walked silently, heads bowed, wondering if perhaps the problem really was inside them. Not the world, not the pressure, not the grief. Just them. Because in the age of enlightenment, a woman's fear was still considered a flaw to be hidden, not a wound to be heard. As we step into the 17th and 18th centuries, the world is buzzing with progress. Telescopes are peering into the heavens, Philosophers are pondering liberty and reason, and Isaac Newton is explaining gravity, finally giving people a better excuse for falling apart. But if you were a woman during the Enlightenment suffering from anxiety, all that rationality didn't do you much good. Because while the world was discovering natural laws and human rights, your trembling hands and sleepless nights were still being filed under female problems. Medical men, now wearing powdered wigs and very serious expressions, were beginning to write about the nervous system. They even had a name for women like you, nervous ladies. It sounded polite, maybe even elegant. But behind the label was the same old belief. Women were emotionally delicate, spiritually frail, and biologically built for breakdowns. The uterus, thankfully, had stopped its wandering. But now doctors said women had too many nerves, too much stimulation, too much imagination. In short, the Enlightenment determined that women were simply too much. If you cried often, or became overwhelmed, or had panic attacks, you might be prescribed rest, warm baths, mild walks, or, everyone's favourite, laudanum. A lovely little cocktail of alcohol and opium. Laudanum could quiet your anxiety, your pain, and possibly your pulse. But at least you weren't complaining anymore. For wealthier women, there were nervous retreats, where you'd be waited on by servants while being gently discouraged from reading, thinking or discussing anything upsetting, such as your own emotions. Poorer women didn't have the luxury of sedation. They simply endured. And if you dared express anger, or frustration, or heaven forbid, ambition, you might be considered not just anxious, but unstable, dangerous, mad. Your husband could have you confined. No trial, no explanation, just a signature and silence. This was the Enlightenment. Reason for men, sedation for women. Public discourse for philosophers, private despair for housewives. Logic built libraries, fear locked doors. So as the world basked in the light of discovery, women with anxiety sat quietly in the shadows, medicated, misunderstood, and told that their pain was just a passing flutter of nerves. Nothing to worry about. Just breathe. And don't think too hard. Now we drift into the 19th century, the Victorian age, where everything looks elegant on the surface. Corsets are tight, manners are tighter, and emotional expression, especially for women, is considered downright indecent. Anxiety hasn't disappeared. It's just been rebranded. Welcome to the age of the rest cure, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a man with a fine moustache and questionable empathy. The rest cure was prescribed to women suffering from what was still broadly labelled as nervous disorders. You felt anxious, exhausted, depressed. The solution? Lie in bed, for weeks or months. No reading, no writing, no visitors, no talking about your feelings. Just a plush room, heavy curtains, boiled milk, and the slowly creeping sensation that you might be losing your mind, which ironically you probably were, thanks to the treatment. Women were expected to surrender to stillness, to melt into passivity. Movement was rebellion. Thought was dangerous. If you dared resist, you were said to be resisting healing, which, conveniently, meant more confinement. This was not a fringe treatment. It was widely respected. Famous writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman went through the rest cure herself, and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper. A chilling story about a woman driven mad by her forced silence. Spoiler. It wasn't the wallpaper that broke her. It was the cage of polite, padded neglect. And then there were the asylums. If your anxiety didn't respond to milk and mandatory napping, you might find yourself behind the stone walls of a sanatorium. Once inside, women were subjected to ice baths, electrotherapy, and endless observation. Some were given morphine. Others were restrained for days at a time. Their crime? Crying too much, talking too fast, refusing to smile. And still, no one asked why. No one asked if she'd lost a child, or endured violence, or simply cracked under the weight of perfection. In the Victorian world, women were supposed to be calm, composed, angelic. And if they weren't, they were hidden away, beautifully, quietly, tragically, because society wasn't built to treat anxious women. It was built to keep them from disrupting the dinner table. Welcome to the early 1900s, where corsets were loosening, the industrial age was humming, and a man named Sigmund Freud had taken up the peculiar hobby of blaming almost everything on your childhood, or your father. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, offered a revolutionary idea. Maybe women weren't suffering from demons or defective wombs. Maybe it was their minds, their unconscious, their repressed desires, their unresolved issues. Now, that should have been a turning point, a moment of progress. And in a way, it was. Instead of dunking anxious women in cold water or feeding them opium, doctors now invited them to lie on a couch and talk. Revolutionary, right? But before we uncork the champagne, let's talk about how they were expected to talk. Freud and his followers often viewed anxiety in women as the result of repressed sexual desire or internalized guilt, usually directed at their parents. If you were anxious, it was likely because you were suppressing something scandalous. You just didn't know it yet. Were you afraid to leave the house? Clearly symbolic. Having recurring nightmares? Probably a metaphor for your mother. Panic attacks? Definitely something Freudian. Probably phallic. And while this new method of treatment was less physically violent, it still came with its own subtle form of blame. The problem was inside you. Not your circumstances, not the trauma, not the stifling expectations placed on your shoulders. You just needed to unpack it. And if you didn't get better, maybe you weren't trying hard enough. Maybe you were resisting the truth. Psychoanalysis spread like wildfire among the intellectual elite. In smoky Viennese rooms, doctors scribbled notes while women whispered about their dreams and fears, still trying to be taken seriously, still trying to be heard. It was progress, yes, but fragile progress. Because even though the cages had been traded for couches, women's anxiety was still being interpreted through a male lens, often reduced to libido, longing, or lingering daddy issues. And so, the question remained. Could a woman ever simply be anxious without being seen as broken? Or would every tremble, every tear, every silent scream be pinned to a theory instead of a truth? It's the 1950s now. The war is over, the lawn is trimmed, and your casserole is expected to be on the table by 6. You're a woman in suburbia, polished nails, bright smile, pearls around your neck, and your anxiety? Well, darling, that's not something we talk about, because according to glossy magazines and daytime radio, everything is fine. So why do you feel like screaming? Enter Mother's Little Helper, the nickname for a small pill with a big promise: calmness. Specifically, Valium and its earlier cousin, Miltown. These little sedatives were marketed directly to women, especially housewives, who felt overwhelmed, underappreciated, or quietly unraveling in a sea of matching Tupperware. Feeling sad? Anxious? Numb? Just pop a pill, dear, and smile for the neighbours. Doctors handed them out like candy. No one asked about trauma. No one asked about loneliness. No one wondered if spending every day vacuuming in heels while pretending everything was perfect might be crushing. Because in this new world of conformity and consumerism, a woman's role was to be content. And if she wasn't, clearly something was wrong with her. Not the role, not the expectations, not the endless isolation. Pharmaceutical companies leaned into this narrative with disturbing enthusiasm. One ad for tranquilizers featured a woman gripping the sink with the caption, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less trapped." Another proudly promised peace of mind for overburdened housewives. You know, the ones holding the family together with a smile and a rising dose of benzodiazepines. By the 1960s, millions of women were medicated, not because they were mentally ill, but because they were exhausted. Because they were sad and didn't know why. Because they were human in a culture that didn't allow them to be. And while these drugs offered short-term relief, they often came with long-term dependency. But no one talked about that. Addiction, after all, was considered unladylike. So they smiled. They swallowed. And somewhere deep beneath the sedation, the real question lingered. What if her anxiety wasn't a disorder? What if it was a warning? A silent scream from a soul that was never allowed to speak? By the 1970s, something had shifted. The casserole was still warm, the house still tidy. But now, the woman inside it had questions. Like, why am I the only one sedated? Why does my pain come with a prescription, but not a conversation? And who decided that anxiety was something I should apologize for? The feminist movement was swelling, not with rage, but with clarity. Women were beginning to talk. In consciousness-raising groups across living rooms and campuses, they compared notes. And what they discovered was they weren't alone. Anxiety, they realized, wasn't some personal flaw. It wasn't just hormones or hysteria. It was often the logical result of being overworked, unheard, and expected to perform emotional labor like it was part of the furniture. Books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan cracked the polished surface of post-war domesticity, revealing the problem that has no name. It described women who felt empty, anxious, restless, despite having everything society told them they should want. Finally, someone said it. It's not in your head. It's in the walls, the expectations, the silence. And once the silence broke, there was no going back. Women began reclaiming their stories. They stopped accepting tranquilizers as apologies. They started questioning the institutions that had pathologized their emotions for centuries. In therapy rooms, a new kind of counselor was emerging, one who actually listened, one who didn't assume every panic attack was a cry for marriage or motherhood. Women entered psychology, medicine, and psychiatry, not just as patients, but as professionals. It wasn't perfect. Misdiagnosis was still common, bias still lingered, and pharmaceutical companies were still very busy. But something important had changed. Women were talking. And this time, they weren't being interrupted. They were connecting the dots between personal pain and societal pressure, between internal struggle and external structure. They were rewriting the narrative from what's wrong with me to what happened to me. And slowly, painfully, the world began to shift. Because when women stopped whispering and started comparing notes, they discovered something revolutionary. That their anxiety wasn't madness. It was truth. Trying to find a voice in a world that never wanted to hear it. As the 1980s and 90s rolled in, women's anxiety finally got a proper name. Not hysteria, not nerves, not "she's just tired," but actual diagnostic terms. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, PTSD. Finally, a medical vocabulary that didn't blame the womb. Progress, right? Well, sort of. Psychiatry was getting more precise. The DSM, the big diagnostic manual with all the mental health labels, was growing thicker, and insurance companies were starting to reimburse treatments. But even as the science evolved, the experience of being a woman with anxiety still came with familiar echoes of doubt, dismissal, and stigma. Let's say you were a woman in 1993 having panic attacks. You go to a doctor, heart pounding, palms sweating, afraid you're dying. He might hand you a pamphlet, a prescription for Xanax, and a polite suggestion to get some rest. At least they'd stopped blaming your uterus. Now they were blaming your lifestyle. You're working too hard. You're probably just overwhelmed. Have you tried jogging? And sure, therapy was now a real option, if you could afford it. But finding a therapist who wouldn't assume your anxiety was just being emotional could still be a challenge. If you cried in the session, you were labelled fragile. If you didn't, maybe you were in denial. Either way, your diagnosis came with an asterisk. Still, for many women, finally having a name for what they felt was like being handed a mirror after years in the dark. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't personal failure. It was real. And it had been there all along. Medications improved too. SSRIs, drugs like Prozac and Zoloft, became household names, marketed as modern solutions to modern struggles. And for many, they truly helped. But again, they often came without a full explanation. No one was digging deeper into trauma, history, generational patterns. Just take this, feel better. So yes, progress was made, but it was clinical, not compassionate, structured, not sensitive. The labels were new, but the loneliness, still painfully familiar. Because even with names and pills and pamphlets, the question still lingered in the quiet. Will someone ever ask why I'm afraid? Welcome to the 2000s, where flip phones were cool, low-rise jeans were confusing, and for the first time in centuries, people started asking not just what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. It was a quiet revolution, not one with banners or protests, but with TED Talks, memoirs, and slowly shifting clinical conversations. Researchers, therapists, and trauma survivors began connecting dots that had long been ignored. Anxiety wasn't just a chemical imbalance or a random quirk. Sometimes, it was a normal response to a life that hadn't been very kind. And suddenly, Three words entered the spotlight: trauma-informed care. Instead of treating anxiety like an individual defect, this approach asked bigger questions. What experiences shaped your nervous system? What patterns are your body trying to survive? What if your hypervigilance isn't irrational, but learned? This wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal, especially for women. Because now, anxiety could be traced back to things no one wanted to talk about: abuse, neglect, generational pressure, workplace harassment, the emotional weight of performing perfection while quietly breaking inside. For many, this brought relief, even validation. For the first time, their fear wasn't a flaw, it was a wound, and wounds can heal. But this wasn't a magical fix. Society still loved productivity more than peace. Women still faced pressure to be calm, capable, and composed, even while managing households, careers, children, and the growing stack of mental health buzzwords. Burnout, imposter syndrome, high-functioning anxiety, all terms that sounded new but often felt old. And while therapy was more accessible, it was still expensive, still inconsistent, still uneven. One therapist might hold space. Another might offer unsolicited advice and an awkward smile. Social media helped, and hurt. Women could now share their struggles publicly, creating solidarity across time zones. But they could also be told to drink more water and meditate, instead of addressing years of systemic trauma. Still, something was shifting. Because the world was finally beginning to understand what women had always known. That anxiety wasn't weakness. It was history, whispering through the body, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. Now we arrive in the age of Wi-Fi, wellness influencers, and phones that never let you rest. Welcome to the digital era, where women's anxiety no longer needs a doctor's diagnosis. It just needs a screen. You wake up to 37 notifications, 4 emails, 2 calendar alerts, and a message from someone who just wants to pick your brain. You haven't even had coffee, but your pulse is already sprinting. Anxiety in the digital age isn't just internal, it's interactive and constant. You're expected to be available, responsive, successful, hydrated, emotionally balanced, and preferably glowing, all while maintaining a curated smile on a platform that calls itself social. The modern woman isn't just managing her life, she's managing her brand. And somehow anxiety is both a red flag and an aesthetic now. Posts with "My anxiety is bad today" can trend, as long as they're paired with the right filter and a caption that's self-aware but not too messy. Vulnerability sells, but only if it's digestible. And if you try to unplug, good luck. The world doesn't slow down. The algorithm punishes you. Emails pile up like guilt. Even meditation has become performance art, tracked by an app and graded by your smartwatch. Anxiety is everywhere, but so is advice. You can scroll through reels promising to cure your nervous system in under 30 seconds. Breathwork, matcha, journaling, tapping, all great tools, until they become just another checkbox in your already overfilled day. And through it all, the root of women's anxiety remains surprisingly consistent. Pressure. The pressure to be liked, to be successful, to be informed, responsive, healthy, thin, ethical, kind, efficient, creative, funny, but not too funny. And don't forget to reply to your boss, your best friend, and that mum group chat that somehow never sleeps. It's no wonder your chest feels tight. Because in the age of being on 24/7, rest feels radical. Silence feels suspicious. And peace? That's a full-time job on its own. But here's the quiet truth. Your anxiety isn't a glitch. It's a signal that your nervous system wasn't designed for this much noise. After centuries of being silenced, sedated, shamed, and scrolled into exhaustion, something unexpected is happening. Women are slowing down. Not because the world has eased its grip. It hasn't. But because many are realizing that racing to meet impossible standards only leads to one place: burnout with a side of existential dread. So now, in corners of the internet and quiet living rooms, in yoga studios and therapy circles, a soft revolution is underway. It's not loud. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't wear matching athleisure or quote productivity gurus. It just rests. Rest as resistance. Rest as reclaiming. Rest as the long-forbidden medicine women were denied for centuries, not the forced kind prescribed by Victorian doctors, but the chosen kind. The kind that says, I don't owe anyone my exhaustion. Women are learning to say no, not as a failure, but as a boundary. They're cancelling plans, logging off, letting the dishes sit in the sink. And shockingly, the world keeps spinning. It's not easy. The guilt is still there, whispering, you should be doing more. But now there's another voice rising beside it, a quieter one. You've done enough for today. Breathe. Communities are forming around this truth. Groups of women who hold space for each other without judgment. Who say, me too, instead of, why can't